Don't you worry, the clip's about to begin, but don't forget to subscribe.
Next up, we've got Greg from Atlanta, and he's a recent atheist, and he wants advice on how to handle conspiracy theories, racial unrest, racial unrest using skepticism to come to accurate conclusions. So, let's see. Hello there, Greg. How you doing?
I'm good. How are you?
Doing all right.
Good. Yes. I think you summed it up pretty well. I am recently atheist, and because of the pandemic and the quarantine, I have kind of just been going down a rabbit hole of discovering new things. And so I'm kind of using skepticism to unpack all of my beliefs. And, with everything that's going on, people are, what I've kind of noticed is that many of the conspiracy theorists that we think are kind of crazy, I think they became conspiracy theorists for the same reason that I became an atheist. They were locked at home for like a year and watching YouTube and things like that. And so I'm kind of nervous about that. I don't want to really go down the wrong path, believe things that aren't true. And so I'm just nervous, and I want to make sure that I'm applying the right tools and techniques to actually know what is true and make sure that my internal beliefs match reality.
Right. Well,
that's kind of my question. How do we make sure that we don't become crazy?
Well, step one is to keep asking yourself that question. It's always healthy to engage in metacognition, that is, thinking about how you're thinking and arriving at your conclusions. And I always make sure you're comparing what you're reading from more than one side. Don't get all your news from one source. And I want to say I'm less pessimistic than you are appearing to be, because I think the conspiracy stuff is kind of dwindling. Trump was kind of leading the charge with that. And I noticed pretty much immediately once they banned him from Twitter, all these people that used to be hardcore MAGA people that would always be arguing about Trump stuff or whatever, they don't seem to have much to talk about anymore. Yeah, there are spaces that they can still go to and gather and talk shit and stuff, but most people are not that invested in it. It's just something that they read and it sounded all right to them, and they might pop in and make the occasional comment. But once you cut off the head of the snake with getting Trump and a couple others off of most social media platforms, they're not going to go seek them out. I think now social media is kind of this big nasty thing that culturally we haven't even figured out how to deal with yet. Does the First Amendment apply or does it not, because they're private companies? And here I am, a Canadian, talking about the First Amendment as if that's a Canadian thing. But yeah, I'm not entirely optimistic, but I think there is hope for sure. But step one is make sure you are yourself questioning how you're coming to your conclusions.
Right. And what advice I would give you is, understanding the anatomy of the conspiracy theories is really kind of key to not falling into the trap of conspiracy theory. Basically, the anatomy of a conspiracy theory is you take nuggets of truth and then you expand into a narrative that you want to tell. Right. So like with the QAnon conspiracy, you take small nuggets of truth that, there are some things that this Q person said that that came true or something, some things that any reasonable person could have, quote unquote, predicted that would happen. He said, so therefore, this QAnon person has Q level clearance in the government and all this other stuff. And, he says all these crazy things. There's always nuggets of truth in these conspiracy theories that they then, with unsubstantiated reasons, they connect to other things. So the biggest thing that you can do to, I guess, protect yourself against falling into conspiracy theories is always ask for the evidence that you have for whatever thing that they're spouting. If this evidence seems rather unconnected, it's unsupported, or it's ad hoc or something like that, then you can just easily dismiss it until new information arises that points you in the direction of it. And so I would just say, looking at the evidence for it, and coming and making sure that this evidence support the claims that are being made is kind of the one of the cornerstones to protecting yourself against that kind of thing.
And also, one of the most important things you can do. Yeah, another really important thing you can do is make sure you apply this even to things that you want to be true. So, like a good example of this, back in 2016 when Q was first getting started and the first rumblings about a deep state showed up, the first few things I read about the deep state, I was like, wow, are there really people working against Trump at these high levels of government? That would be amazing. I actually wanted that to be true. Not for the same reasons as most people. Right. So I had to kind of apply skepticism to that. And when I'm making my videos, I have to do the same thing. Like I'll be looking for sources, and it's really, really tempting to like go past this headline because that one doesn't say quite what I want it to say. But this one down here does. Like, no, you got to read both of them and check the sources on them and see which one is actually being more accurate than the other. So just make sure you hold the beliefs that you have, that you want to believe, to the same standards as the ones that you do not.
Right. And I have kind of a specific topic that's kind of big here in America, with all of the police brutality. I really started unpacking my bias as an African American about, racism. Is there systemic racism in this country? And, I try to watch different news sources. Obviously, they conflict. But I just wonder, like, does it apply to politics and these types of issues, or is that kind of just form your own opinion?
Well, I mean, I would say everything that both of us have said tonight applies to just about any subject that you can think of. As far as politics go, I think having the evidence to support a claim is pretty crucial if you want to examine whether or not the claim is true. I mean, did you have anything in particular about the systemic racism that you had in mind?
Yeah, I kind of, like I said, kind of been using skepticism lately. And so with two recent things that happened, the Breonna Taylor incident, and I don't know if you're very familiar with it, but police were serving a warrant, and it was a no-knock warrant, and the boyfriend of Breonna Taylor had a gun, and he shot at the police, and she got shot. And it was kind of unfortunate, but kind of when I broke it down, it didn't really seemed like racism. And even the mass shooting at the
this is where the
Asian massage parlors.
Sorry, Greg, if I could just, before we get to the mass shooting,
necessarily a racist issue.
Well, so Greg, if we can handle one thing at a time.
Specifically about the Breonna Taylor issue, it's not that people, I mean, it's entirely possible. I don't know. I haven't looked into it. Like, I know the general story, but I haven't delved into the details. But it's not specifically that those cops who did the thing with Breonna Taylor were racist. Were they? I don't know. I haven't looked into it.
Right.
But the system is set up such that no-knock warrants, like there's whole segments you can watch on this for like that have the actual data and have looked into it. I'm kind of doing this on the fly, so I have to go by memory, which memory's not great. But like no-knock warrants are executed way more frequently in black neighborhoods. There's the police are much more likely to be harsher on on black people that have drugs or guns or whatever. Like, I just saw a video the other day of, like, there's a white guy walking down the street with an AK-47, or not AK-47, AR-15, and cop just walks up to him and is like, just tell me where you're going, let me check your ID, and everything was fine. And then the rest of the video is like 15 minutes of a black guy doing the exact same thing. Cop doesn't even talk to him, just gets out, points his gun at him, yells at him to get on the ground, and calls in like 5 more squad cars for backup. And so it's when we say it's systemic, it's not that any one individual cop that did this bad thing is racist. It's that the system is set up in such a way that these racist issues are still persisting. Like there are still people alive today that remember what it was like to live in a society where black people were not allowed to marry white people. It's functionally impossible for the systems that were set up like that to have been completely dismantled by this point. There hasn't been enough change for that to happen. So systemic racism is a real issue, and it may vary on an individual level, but it really is there.
Good point. Good point.
Well, yeah, and if you want further evidence, if you want some further examples, I mean, if you just look at how the police handled the militia at the Michigan State House, if you want to look at that and see how they were handled versus the protests with the Black Lives Matter protests that happened last summer, I mean, those are stark contrasts. And I'm not talking about the riots that eventually developed. I'm talking about the peaceful protests and how they were handled. I mean, you had cops that were willing to run over people. You had cops that were beating people with no reason. The only reason that I could see is that the cops knew that they could beat on those people, whereas the militia people are crazy enough to start shooting. You know, so I feel like it's very much a systemic issue. But I'm sorry, you were going to say?
Sorry, I kind of lost my point. But I think kind of the context I was going to give to it is that I wonder if the older generation are just being triggered, you know, and that's kind of where I was applying skepticism to it. Is like in each of these individual incidents, for instance, the Breonna Taylor incident, there was a lot of NBA players and NFL players and everything saying justice for Breonna. And, you know, again, I'm not sure that incident was racist. However, you make a good point. There's
using one incident to make a point that this is a systemic issue, because it's like the ones that we hear about are in the minority. Like they're usually the really, really bad ones, but they're like people like I've been pulled over a number of times in my life. Never once have I been scared for my life in that situation. But I've talked to black people that live in the States, and they are like, if they get pulled over, they have to be careful, like have both their hands up on the steering wheel, turn on the interior lights so the cop can see that. And like, these things never even occurred to me to do. So it's the difference between me being able to tell my kids that if you see a cop, that's someone safe that you can go talk to, and someone that lives in a neighborhood that is regularly roughed up by the cops, not being able to say the police are there to help you and protect you. Because the truth of the matter is, often they aren't.
Right. And I think, you know, the riots that happened at the Capitol, January 6th, that definitely kind of sealed it in my mind as far as there's two different systems of treatment. Two different types of people.
Yeah. Yeah, that's another good example of how the system treats, you know, treats white people different than black, or not black people specifically, but people of color. So, I mean, what I think that you need to do as far as like the Breonna Taylor incident is that you don't need to look at this single incident and try to determine whether or not the cops were being racist. It's the system that ended up with the cops being there, and how the cops are trained in this preconceived notion in their mind about the people that they were going to serve this no-knock warrant to, I think is really what you got to look at. And I think that if you look at it from that point of view,
analogy, it's kind of like how, if I could just quickly make an analogy, it's kind of like any one incident is not necessarily itself racist. However, it is likely it's indicative of a larger pattern. So it'd be similar to like climate change. Any one hurricane that we see in a season, that hurricane is not necessarily because of climate change. However, because climate change is a real thing that is happening, these increased hurricanes are indicative of the pattern, of the greater pattern. This is kind of the same thing there. Like any one individual incident may or may not be, and it's hard to tell sometimes, but they are indicative of the pattern.
Right. Right. That's a good analogy. Yeah, I was really trying to check my bias, you know, and just make sure that, you know, that I'm believing true things,
Yeah,
and not just being triggered by past circumstances. So
yeah, that's a great attitude to have.
That's helpful.
Yeah.
Thanks.
All right, Greg. Well, unless there's anything else. Huh? Okay, if that's all you have, I guess that we'll talk to you next time. We really appreciate you calling in and talking with us. I think this was a really good, productive conversation, so I really do appreciate that.
Yeah, I did. I enjoyed it. Thanks so much.
Thanks so much for calling.
Thank you, Greg. You have a good night now.
You too.
All right. Well, that was an interesting conversation. You know, I don't really get to talk about the kind of socio-political type of thing all that much, so that was kind of refreshing. Did you have any thoughts about that, Viced?
I think I got pretty much everything out.
Hello, sinners. It's me, and you're watching The Line. Hit that subscribe button and consider ringing that bell, because if you do, an angel will get its wings.